Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's April 30th, 2026. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host Ness. We're going to pick up where we left off last week, applying the Burnham framework to current events and public figures. We covered Russell Brand last week. For a brief refresher on the Burnham framework, there's a lot to it. The thing we focused on the most was Burnham's discussion of Pareto's division of the elite into two categories, foxes and lions. Individuals marked as lions live by their wits. They put their reliance on fraud, deceit, and shrewdness. They do not have strong attachment to family, church, nation, and traditions, though they may exploit these attachments in others. They live in the present, taking little thought of the future, and are always ready for change, novelty, and adventure. In economic affairs, they incline towards speculation, promotion, innovation. They are not adept, as a rule, in the use of force. They are inventive and chance-taking. Then lions are able and ready to use force, relying on it rather than brains to solve their problems. They are conservative, patriotic, loyal to tradition, and solidly tied to supra-individual groups like family or church or nation. They are concerned for posterity and the future. In economic affairs, they are cautious, saving, and orthodox. They distrust the new and praise character and duty rather than wits. So we're going to apply that framework to Tucker Carlson. And we have discussed in a previous episode, I get triggered by Tucker in a lot of ways. I have a lot of respect for some of the ideas that he expresses, but I'm frustrated by what I view as constant deceit and lies and hypocrisy. And Ness helped me understand maybe what I'm missing in that I'm applying a intellectual framework to Tucker Carlson, evaluating him as if he were an intellectual, when the more correct frame to look at him is as a popularizer. And he takes arguments and ideas from thinkers, people like Sam Francis, Pat Buchanan, James Burnham, who we're discussing here, and distills them and takes pieces of them, and he pieces them together in a way that's not always consistent and is contradictory and is often frustrating.
I don't think it's necessarily contradictory if he is assessed for doing what I suspect he is doing, which is going through the necessary steps to effectively make himself the godfather of dissidents. He's taking dissidents from all different corners of the political and cultural spectrums, those outside the Overton window, outside of welcoming good graces in corporate media or other institutional structures, be they people interested in aliens or spirituality and demons or human biodiversity like Steve Saylor, social conservatives like Matt Walsh, libertine investigative journalists like Glenn Greenwald, and everyone in between. And a lot of these disparate thinkers are sniping at one another on an almost continuous basis, but they all have a good relationship with Tucker Carlson. And I, as we've recounted here previously, I think he is a dark horse for the 2028 Republican presidential nomination, and this is the way to build a populist power base outside of the corporate party structure. And I think it's about the only way to do it, which is to effectively unite all the various dissident strains of thought in the United States under his broad umbrella banner. And so it's not necessarily that he is inconsistent, or it may in a tautological sense, it may be that there are inconsistencies there, but he is trying to do his best to bring all of these things together and not unnecessarily reject one form of dissonant thought to include another, but instead make it as big a dissident tent as he possibly can. And I think if you view what he's doing from that vantage point, a lot of things will fall into place and it will make more sense.
I agree with a lot of that, but as we'll get into, I don't think that explains or in any way justifies a lot of the deceit. There really doesn't seem any. Maybe we'll discuss that, but the only way explanation that makes sense for me on a lot of these is he's just a pathological liar, and he's out for his own self-interest. And so, getting back to the Pareto framework as articulated by Burnham, Tucker is a quintessential fox. He cloaks himself, as Burnham mentions, as Pareto mentions, often foxes cloak themselves in lion attributes, and Tucker does that. He portrays himself as a Christian, as a social conservative, as a family man, and all those. He has praises traditional virtues, like, for instance, telling the truth always. That should be your guiding light, according to him, is always tell the truth. And so he uses all the outward signs of a lion, but his behavior is pure fox. So let's start with his relationship with Donald Trump over the years. I'll give a few snapshots of him, starting of Tucker Carlson's description of Donald Trump, starting back in 1999. Here's a quote from Tucker referring to Trump. Quote, "He is the single most repulsive person on the planet." That was in 99. And then jumping ahead to 2016, Tucker described Trump as not evil, just mentally ill. In 2021, Tucker said, "I hate Trump passionately," and called him a demonic force and a destroyer. And then in July 2024, Tucker described Trump as a wonderful, wonderful person, the funniest person I've ever met in my life. And then most recently, in April 2026, Tucker said, "I want to say I'm sorry for misleading people. I'll be tormented by it for a long time."
I think Carlson and others who have buyer's remorse for supporting Trump in the second administration are owed some grace. Trump is a unique figure in a lot of ways. One of the reasons that the rhetorical approach that the managerial state and the Democratic Party, and to a large extent the Republican Party, took in 2016, and why it was ultimately ineffective, is because they tried to portray Trump as this wild bull in a china shop, crazy, unpredictable, mercurial figure, when that is the exact opposite of who Trump was. Trump is a fixture in the American cultural psyche. He is Americana of the second half of the 20th century. He's the avatar of it like almost no other figure is. And he was almost comically consistent in the way he dressed, in the way he spoke, in the things that he believed, all the way through his first presidential campaign, where he was effectively the exact same 1980s Democrat that he first became famous for in New York when he first entered the political arena. None of his beliefs had changed about trade or immigration or hard-nosed criminal enforcement. He was such a staple that he had cameo appearances in movies like Home Alone too. He was a womanizer and a glad-hander, an understated comical relief figure, someone who sold the sizzle more than the steak. All of these things he was well known for, and was so consistently well known for because he didn't change at all. And so these attempts to portray him as some madman out of left field just didn't land with the resonance that the deep state hoped that they would. But in 2024, the President Trump of the second Trump administration really does seem to have changed in a way that he hadn't changed throughout the course of his very public adult life that spanned over 50 years in the limelight. And so I would give a little more grace to people here post re-election, where he had campaigned on being Trump administration one on steroids, and in the first couple of months in his flurry of executive orders seemed like he was moving in that direction, but that quickly dissipated, and now he seems like a figure that is largely unrecognizable to a lot of the people who campaigned for him in the 2024 presidential election cycle. That doesn't address the very standard neocon criticisms that Tucker Carlson expressed about Trump from the late 90s until well into his first administration. But if we grant sincerity to Tucker Carlson's conversion experience from being a member of the managerial elite in good standing to effectively a class traitor on the outside, then the switch from that late 90s through the mid 2010s, the switch from that revulsion at Trump to seeing him as someone who is warm and funny and all of the things that the MAGA movement finds endearing about Trump. If Tucker Carlson's conversion is real, then that is not particularly surprising.
I agree with your point broadly in general, but as applied to Tucker, I don't really think it fits, because Tucker called Trump a demonic force in 2021, or in 2020, 2021. That was during his first term, where I think Trump, as many problems as there were in the first term, I think Trump was largely following through on his campaign promises. And so there wasn't really a justification for Tucker saying those things based on Trump betraying his ideals or what he promised. You could criticize Trump on being incompetent and being a lion, as we said last week, who was taken advantage of by the foxes who Trump let into the henhouse, so to speak. I'm mixing metaphors really poorly, but you get my point. So focusing in on the 2020, 2021, give a little context, that was the election of 2020 when Trump was disputing it and filed multiple lawsuits and had focused all his energy on disputing the election. And Fox News jumped on that bandwagon pretty much fully. And although I think Trump was mad at them for calling one of the states in 2020 early, and then maybe Fox News was trying to get back in his good graces by pushing the stolen election narrative really hard and having all the hosts, even if they didn't personally believe in it, they obviously got the line from the Fox executives that they have to push that story. And Tucker was pressured into pushing a story that he obviously knew or believed was completely bogus. And the private text messages of Tucker showed that, and I guess that was the context when Tucker was calling Trump demonic. And then using that word demonic, unless Tucker was just using it in a flippant way, again, maybe I'm trying to take him at face value. He apparently believes that demons are real and that they are acting on the material world in a real way. So if he's really believes that Trump represents demonic forces, and Tucker's a genuine Christian, so he says, how could you possibly support somebody like that?
In the Christian spiritual context, demons in particular act by taking something good and perverting it to evil ends. And so in the case of Trump contesting the election, and I am woefully ignorant of what went on in cable news in the aftermath of the 2020 election. I didn't know that Tucker Carlson ever was really forced into. I know he had like Sidney Powell on, but he was very critical of her and asked when she was going to release some of the information. And he took a lot of heat from MAGA supporters for his incredulity about the election allegedly being stolen. And so in that context, if you felt like the entire network was being bent towards a narrative that was going to be destructive of the movement that Trump had spearheaded, that had made himself an avatar of over the first term, then I could see in frustration privately texting other colleagues that he is demonic. In that, from an America First perspective, the first term left, yes, much to be desired, but moved things forward in a way that would have been inconceivable 5, 10, 15 years prior. And Tucker Carlson presumably perceived that all of the things that Trump had accomplished and the shifting of the political and cultural landscape and in general, and what was expected and what would be supported among Republican Party members by the Republican grassroots in particular, that Trump had done so much work to change that for the better, and that he was on the precipice of blowing it all on this crazy election fraud conspiracy theory story that he, even though he asked and asked and asked, couldn't get any hard data on what it was that Trump and the Trump associates kept saying that they had. They famously called it the Kraken that was going to be released, and it just never got released. This was in a text message to other colleagues that was discovered in the wake of the Dominion voting lawsuit against Fox News that Tucker Carlson got wrapped up in, even though he was the most incredulous, the most antagonistic to what Fox was trying to do in terms of disputing the election. These were private messages among colleagues. Imagine your boss comes through and makes some assessment one day that upsets you for whatever reason, and you text one of your coworkers that, man, Jim's a real demonic asshole. We've been working hard on that, and he just came in and then destroyed it, or something along those lines. We could see just blowing off steam, and it's not necessarily fair to view that as a holistic lifetime assessment of a figure.
I would agree with that if this were the only time that Tucker had trashed Trump, but as we've seen, he's trashed him multiple times throughout the years. And to give a little more context on the Dominion lawsuit, Dominion Voting Systems was the plaintiff. Fox News Network was the defendant. It was a defamation lawsuit arising from Fox's post-election coverage. And Fox had aired a lot of commentary that Dominion's voting machines had been used to steal the 2020 election. And so as part of that, it didn't actually go to trial, but in the course of the discovery process, a bunch of internal text messages from Fox employees and hosts came out, among them Tucker Carlson. And so Tucker Carlson told Laura Ingraham that Sidney Powell was lying, by the way. I caught her. It's insane. And then Tucker, as we said, I hate him passionately, referring to Trump. So obviously Tucker did not believe the stolen election narrative, and presumably, if we're to take him at face value, which I argue is a mistake, but if we are, that truth is the ultimate arbiter, is the ultimate guide that one should follow in one's life, especially as a Christian, one would think that Tucker would do everything in his power to, at the very least, push back on the narrative and to, at the very least, give the other side of the narrative. However, that is belied by when on October 12, 2020, there was a Fox reporter who posted a tweet which was supposedly fact-checking claims that Trump and other Fox News hosts were making about Dominion. And I think this reporting has been largely vindicated, and basically saying that there had been no evidence of the voting machine fraud. And so in the midst of this, Tucker texted Sean Hannity saying, quote, "Please get her fired." Her being the fact checker. Seriously, what the fuck? I'm actually shocked. It needs to stop immediately, like tonight. It's measurably hurting the company. The stock price is down. Not a joke. So I just don't know what other way something like that can be spun other than Tucker is a liar and he claims that he cares about truth, but he's saying blatantly he cares more about money. and that just seems like pure Fox to me, and about as big a repudiation of the lion mindset as you could find.
As I'm not going to dispute that a cable news host personality is not a paragon of veracity, I think it is important always to measure these people against other people, against their peers, and to kick back to what we had said previously that Jeff mentioned about Tucker being a popularizer rather than a deep intellectual thinker. I think that holds here. And yes, there is legitimate criticism for having multiple objectives in mind simultaneously that Tucker Carlson is doing here. But I think that this does fold into the desire Carlson had to maintain what the first Trump administration had built and also maintain the financial viability of Fox. And so it doesn't seem inconsistent to me that he would both be opposed to Fox News going on and on about the alleged conspiracies regarding the 2020 election, while also when those same conspiracies that they put so much energy into reporting on, when they were undercutting the message that he never wanted them to push in the first place, but now that they had to undercut it in such a publicly and humiliating way, coupled with the fact that if News Corp stock was down 8 or 10% that day, Tucker Carlson's net worth could literally have dropped by 7 or 8 figures in a matter of hours. And so again, this is a private text message to another person who presumably experienced the same $10 million drop in his net worth over that reporting.
So we both agree that Tucker's guiding light is certainly not truth, despite what he says. And I think we would also both agree he's a pure Fox. And I guess the difference is that doesn't really seem to bother you. It does bother me.
Well, as we discussed last week, the managerial state, or globo homo, doesn't permit lions to survive, to flourish. It's foxes all the way down. Everyone is a fox. To be on Fox or CNN or MSNBC or any of these other corporate media to have any of these institutional positions of power requires being a fox. The foxes are always warning about the dangers of a lion, but they never let a lion get within 100 miles of the chicken coop that all the foxes are in. And so I don't expect anything more from somebody like Tucker Carlson. I don't know if I would go so far as to say with somebody like Tucker Carlson that truth isn't something that has any value, but I do not think it has predominant or certainly exclusive value. And I think there really is, by the nature of being in the position he is in, if truth was the paramount and exclusive virtue to be pursued at the expense of all other things, well, there are people out there who have to use anonymous accounts, who have no ability to leverage their truth obsession to anything that will benefit them on a personal level, because that is the nature of the world that we live in, that unbridled truth-telling is not something that leads to success in the modern managerial state.
I would pick one, I think, exception to that, and specifically in the media space, which is Glenn Greenwald. I think he pursues truth in his work at the expense of almost every other thing that I can think of. He took great personal risk when he worked with Edward Snowden in the 2010s, for instance, and he has left at least one media outlet that I assume he was being remunerated quite well for because of principled stands. So he certainly has his blind spots, but I never get the impression that he's deliberately lying or deceiving in the subjects he covers.
He is one of the most loquacious people, able to think on his feet, and a very good investigative journalist. He is the top of his craft, as someone I have a massive amount of respect for, and yet as successful as he is the best of the best in my view, and yet he has no ability at all to mobilize any sort of support at all to do much of anything. He lives in Brazil. He's not, to go back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of the speculation regarding what Tucker Carlson may be trying to do to build a base of support for a 2028 presidential election run, Glenn Greenwald has nothing like the base of support that Tucker Carlson does.
And so your thesis is that a large amount of deception and lying is required, essentially acting like a fox, which inherently involves deception. That is a prerequisite for any sort of institutional power or wielding of power.
For coalition building in particular, for organizing and bringing disparate people together to have some larger aim, a larger objective. Yes, I think that the truth tellers who bravely shout into the ether the truth that they discover have a ceiling on how high they can rise, and in particular have a ceiling on their ability to move and to wield institutional power in particular. And I think Glenn Greenwald is a perfect example of that, because I would struggle to find someone who is a better version of the things that Glenn Greenwald is celebrated for, and yet the influence that he can have on the American political scene is to not be much more than a political gadfly. And for what it's worth, Tucker Carlson does understand the value that Glenn Greenwald brings. Glenn Greenwald is one of the people, one of the slivers of dissidents that Tucker Carlson is uniting under his Godfather umbrella.
Quoting Burnham, "The primary object of every elite or ruling class is to maintain its own power and privilege. The rule of the elite is based upon force and fraud."
If you're struggling to think of an example of where that fits, think of COVID and the way the elite managed that response.
Quoting Burnham again, "The political life of the masses and the cohesion of society demand the acceptance of myths. In short, the leaders, if they themselves are scientific, must lie. It is hard to lie all the time in public, but to keep privately an objective regard for the truth. Not only is it hard, it is often ineffective, for lies are often not convincing when told with a divided heart." Basically, Burnham is saying that the society is always going to be ruled by a small group of people known as the elite, and essentially deceit and lies are an essential part of that ruling class. It's the only way that a healthy society, as the Machiavellians would describe it, can function. Burnham sees the great mass of people lacking the essential psychological qualities for active political life, and those qualities include ambition and ruthlessness, among others. And ambition and ruthlessness are often at odds with truth. And getting back to Glenn Greenwald and Tucker Carlson, I was blackpilled by Ness when he brought it to my attention that Glenn Greenwald has gone to bat for Tucker Carlson and basically has said that Tucker is the exact same on air as he is off air, and basically batting away any insinuation that Tucker is not 100% honest. And that is so clearly not true that it made me, I guess, secondarily question my trust and belief in Glenn Greenwald, because is he just lying on behalf of Tucker? Because Glenn is saying something that's, in my view, clearly not true. I guess the most charitable interpretation would be Glenn Greenwald is just blinded by his personal friendship with Tucker. But then that makes me think, well, what else is Glenn Greenwald getting completely wrong?
It could be, again, a question of semantics. This is a recurring theme here when it comes to the behavioral tendencies of humans. Somebody like Tucker Carlson, when Glenn Greenwald assesses that he is genuine, the same person on air that he is off air, that doesn't necessarily mean, in fact, I don't read that at all to mean that Tucker Carlson is internally consistent from day to day, because Tucker Carlson exhibits wild swings in emotion and in how the decorum that he carries himself with. He swings from wanting to have a sort of button down, waspy approach to things, and then does his signature high pitched ha 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 cackling, and then takes below the belt, sort of off the cuff insults about people after 15 minutes previously talking about how he needs to treat people honorably and not say things behind their backs and that sort of thing. And then 15 minutes later, he'll ha 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 ha. Like, that is a very evil man. This person is a very bad person. He's a very stupid person. He'll say those sort of things parenthetically without expounding on them. And so he does have an addict's personality. That's how I assess it. And that's not something I'm saying that I'm getting that knowledge from the clouds about. He has talked about it previously. He has struggled with alcohol in the past, and he exhibits that sort of addict behavior where wild emotional swings and emotional regulation is something that's very difficult. That's what causes people to not be able to muster the force of will to resist their addictions, is that they feel so strongly, that they get so overpowered with whatever their desire is or whatever their feeling is, whatever their emotional state is, that they have to express it in the case of an emotional state, and they have to satiate it in the case of some sort of desire. He's also going on and on, singing the praises almost worshipfully about the benefits of nicotine and salivating over how he wishes he could still smoke. And since he can't smoke, he's going to pop. Well, he used to do Zins, but now he's got his own brand, Alp, that he pushes. And so even though he doesn't drink anymore, he does constantly have this nicotine flow going on. And so I think he is, again, to apologize for him in the technical sense of the term, Glenn Greenwald assessing that he is the same person on air as he is off air could be true, because you could see him just as he does on air. You could see him going back and forth, doing a 180 on his personal feelings for a figure from one moment to the next. And that is, of course, not all bad. That's why he's one of the most, or that's part of the reason that he is one of the most successful, important media figures, arguably, in the entire world now, because although there are some dark sides of having that strong feeling, that addict personality, if leveraged correctly, it also can be utilized for maximum charisma and sensationalism and engaging, entertaining on-air presence.
Part of also what fascinates me about Tucker Carlson is the opaque nature of what he's doing. We've tried to figure out exactly what it is. Ness obviously has a theory that Tucker has political ambitions, and somebody like, for instance, Ben Shapiro, he doesn't bother me as much, I guess, because to me it's very clear what he's doing. He's a Jewish nationalist, and when you understand that, everything he does makes sense, and it's understandable. I mean, there is some deception in there because he pretends like he's America first, but he's obviously Israel first. But with Tucker, it's just, I don't understand what he's doing. Let me just give another example. He had an interview with Piers Morgan. It was late 2025. I want to say within the last six months or so, and it was just this throwaway moment where the discussion of Britain's demographic transformation came up, and I think they were specifically talking about London and how it's just become much less white than it has been traditionally for centuries. And Tucker Carlson basically Piers Morgan was saying, what's the big deal? That's fine. I don't have a problem with my country being transformed. Look at all the great restaurants I get. And Tucker was real quick and sharp to criticize Piers Morgan and basically saying, like, how dare you? How can you just turn your back on your country like that and treat treat that demographic transformation of your country in such a flippant manner? And then shortly after, I want to say within like a week, Tucker interviewed George Galloway, a member of the British Parliament, in November of 2025. And Galloway said that Britain becoming more non-white was not a problem. And Tucker Carlson didn't push back at all. And just a week or so before that, when he interviewed Piers Morgan, it was the complete opposite. He jumped down Piers Morgan's throat.
That is a perfect illustration of what I was talking about previously in terms of trying to be a big tent for dissidents. George Galloway became internationally famous heroically, in my view, over 20 years ago when he vociferously opposed the Iraq invasion and was highly critical from the left of the Labour government in the UK under Tony Blair. But the dissident audience that he's trying to cultivate on Piers Morgan is going to be different than the people he is potentially trying to cultivate when it comes to a discussion with George Galloway, who is a traditional leftist, old school, old left type of leftist, where there is a lot of crossover in terms of support for free speech and for social conservatism and for anti-war, non-military interventionism. But there is a divergence there between Tucker Carlson's populist social conservatism and George Galloway's more tolerant view, in particular on multiculturalism, so long as that multiculturalism prioritizes the family and traditional morality.
That's a very difficult needle that Tucker's trying to thread. I'm skeptical that he'll be able to do it, but if he is, that would be incredibly impressive. Another thing Tucker does constantly is praising a figure or a text by implication, while at the same time maintaining plausible deniability. And again, that's a perfect Fox move. So, for example, on August 18th, 2025, Tucker had on R.N. McIntyre, who's a political commentator, and Carlson said, quote, "Read a Lothrop Stoddard book, for example. It's amazing that people wrote stuff like that." He was framing this recommendation as admiration for this intellectual freedom that existed. He doesn't mention that Stoddard was the author of The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy and The Revolt Against Civilization, books that were published in the 1920s. And these books were translated into German and were a big key text in the eugenics program of that era. And Lothrop Stoddard, was an American. He sat on the board of Margaret Sanger's American Birth Control League, which was the predecessor to Planned Parenthood. So Tucker is praising Lothrop Stoddard, and yet I'm sure Tucker knows full well who Stoddard was and what he stood for. And then jumping ahead to April of this year, of 2026, Tucker had on the founder and CEO of Nucleus Genomics, and the episode is titled "Tucker Debates Biotech CEO on Baby Customization, Eugenics, and God's Existence." And throughout that episode, Tucker engages, I would say, in a good faith discussion, but he clearly takes the side against what this biotech company is doing. The company lets parents screen embryos and enables parents to select traits including height, IQ, and disease predisposition. Tucker is clearly against that, and yet just a few months before that, he was praising Lothrop Stoddard. and he thinks abortion is a mortal sin, is murder, plain and simple, murder, the worst kind of murder of complete innocence, and yet Lothrop Stoddard sat on the board of Planned Parenthood. And then more recently, in April of 2026, Tucker had on a Orthodox priest, and in the course of that discussion, St. John Chrysostom came up. He was 4th century Archbishop of Constantinople, and his title, I believe, in the Orthodox Church is Doctor of the Church. He is a towering figure in Christianity, and he authored a liturgy that is still used throughout Eastern Orthodoxy. And he was also the author of Against the Jews, which I believe Ness spoke about on a solo episode recently, but there were about 8 homilies delivered in Antioch around 386, 387 AD. And in that, Chrysostom describes Jews as more savage than any wild beast, describes their synagogues as brothels, dens of robbers, dwelling places of demons, and their souls as inhabited by unclean spirits, and he calls the Jewish people fit for slaughter. So this is a saint and one of the most revered figure, and somebody who Carlson praises and does not give any of this context. And it's curious, you can't help but wonder how, for instance, a Jew would view this, because Tucker is constantly being called an anti-Semite and has been railing against Israel. And I think he described America as caught in the grips of Israelism, obsession with Israel, which is pretty close to saying, about as close as you could get to saying America's controlled by Jews. And then he brings up John Chrysostom and praises him unabashedly, and doesn't bring up any of this. I just find it, I don't know exactly what to make of all of it, how much of it is conscious, but somebody as intelligent and well-read as Tucker, I think he knows what he's doing.
Yes, he is trying to repackage the alt-right Zog meme with regards to Israelism in a way that is more palatable for the Western masses. But this is not a strategy, I think, that is that unusual. Next week, a bit of a spoiler, or maybe the week after when I do a solo episode, one of the topics I'm going to look at are the most favorably viewed figures in world history among Americans. And a little bit of a spoiler there, number 2 on that list globally is Abraham Lincoln. And yet that's because the vast majority of Americans have a positive view of him, white, black, and other. And yet Abraham Lincoln was, to his death, a supporter of the colonization society that would remove all blacks from the United States, send them back to Africa, or find a place in Central or South America for them to be moved from, because he found it a reality that the idea that whites and blacks could live together peaceably and harmoniously was a ridiculous pipe dream that would redound to the detriment of not just whites but also blacks. And so by pointing people to Abraham Lincoln, it could be argued that the same furtive attempt that Tucker Carlson might be making with John Chrysostom or Lothrop Stoddard would be made with regards to Abraham Lincoln, but he has been a saintly figure in the Western canon for over a century now, despite that evidence of him having what is now a very disreputable public position on what to do with blacks following the conclusion of the war, that if anyone espoused anything close to it today, it would potentially bury them. And while it does seem a little bit of a mystery to me as to why he has continued to exist unscathed in terms of his, largely unscathed in terms of his historical reputation, one reason is to repeat the refrain or the lamentation that has been made on previous recordings. It is because so vanishingly few people will read the primary sources, and that's going to be with John Chrysostom or Lothrop Stoddard or Abraham Lincoln. The potential for Tucker Carlson to get in hot water over talking about Stoddard or Chrysostom is mostly not because people will go and read those primary sources, but because the SPLC and ADL types will detect those names as dog whistles that then require them to hone in and attack the people who are recommending those figures. And for whatever reason, that hasn't been done to Abe Lincoln yet. Jeff has a reason that he thinks that could be the case.
Well, I guess I'll ask you a question. Do you think Tucker is knowingly using those names as dog whistles, evoking them in this surreptitious way?
With the case of Stoddard, I think almost certainly, because that is, John Chrysostom is a little bit more arguable in the same way that Martin Luther is more arguable. The anti-Semitism, such as it is, that both of those giants in church history are tagged with, is something that is not exactly secret, but it's not that widely known. And those men are more associated, at least in the literature, in academia, for other things, or in the case of church history, for other things other than their opposition to Jews. But in the case of Stoddard, that is pretty much all that he is known for. He is a almost cartoon villain in the way that he's portrayed as a waspy Aryan eugenicist who really had nothing else to offer.
Abraham Lincoln, I think, gets a pass. For one thing, he came from a very humble background, and his family did not own slaves. Abraham Lincoln never owned slaves. And when he became prominent and somewhat wealthy in his career, his legal career in Springfield, before he ran for public office, he presumably had enough money to have purchased slaves and could have moved to nearby Kentucky, where he was born, and improved his material condition significantly, and he chose not to, presumably out of principle. He exhibits the American ideal of pulling oneself up by their bootstraps. He really came from nothing and earned everything he had, and that is something that, as much admiration as they have for people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, they were born into privilege and material wealth, but that is not the case with Abraham Lincoln, and I think that's part of Lincoln's appeal over those more patrician founding fathers.
Those more white supremacist founding fathers, whereas Abraham Lincoln is definitionally a white nationalist and was to his dying day. Those two terms are often sloppily conflated, but in terms of practical governance, they are wildly disparate. White supremacy is what the South was prior to the onset of the war between the states, and what the North was white nationalists. The idea almost universally held in the North was that whites and blacks could not live in the same society, and that is why Abraham Lincoln's support for the Colonization Society was not remotely controversial at the time, especially in the North, whereas the South and those patrician founding fathers that Jeff mentioned understood a society where whites would rule over non-whites, with blacks in particular, blacks and merciless Indian savages at the bottom of the pecking order, whites at the top, and other races like East Asians in between.
I think Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln would have agreed on quite a bit, particularly colonization and the wisdom of it. Thomas Jefferson knew full well that slavery was wrong, and he is rightly criticized for being a hypocrite in that regard, obviously owning a lot of slaves and most likely fathering children with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings. But Thomas Jefferson clearly knew that slavery was wrong, and he did not believe that blacks and whites could exist peacefully, and that fear of slave revolts was always present among him and Virginians and all white Southerners. And that idea was further bolstered by the slave revolt in Haiti. I think it was called Saint-Domingue at the time. And that revolt occurred, I believe, during Thomas Jefferson's presidency. And then finally, he recognized the horrible situation that America was in. Later in his life in 1820, he was writing during the Missouri crisis when there was a lot of debate and dispute on whether Missouri would enter the Union as a slave state or a free state. And Thomas Jefferson wrote that basically he knew slavery was wrong. He knew it couldn't go on forever, but he saw no way out. He famously analogized the situation as himself and his generation as having caught a wolf by the ears, unable to hold on safely, but also unable to let go safely.
Yes, that was definitely colored by the brutal nature of the Haitian Revolution, the Haitian slave revolt, where every French man, woman, and child was mercilessly butchered in 1804, the consequences of which are still echoing across the world in 2026. I'm a little more skeptical of Jefferson's sincerity. I view it in much the same way as wealthy people today, the limousine liberal types, talking about how great there is a need for them to pay their fair share and for higher taxation. And of course, they could pay more at any time, and Thomas Jefferson could have released his slaves at any time, but he chose not to, and instead just lamented the moral burden that he had to suffer, while the real world material burden was anything but. Instead, it was a benefit that he was able to benefit from. And if he really thought that there was an inherent difficulty for blacks and whites to live together, well, what did he think about the inherent difficulty of black and white existing in a single person? And yet there is the potential that he procreatively made that happen himself. Wherever Thomas Jefferson would have fallen on the George Washington versus Abraham Lincoln perspective, if I were able to go back in time and give one piece of advice to the founding generation and the generations that followed them, it would be that to celebrate the pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality that Jeff was talking about with regards to Abe Lincoln, that Americans should have from the beginning picked their own cotton. Before we close out, I do have to reclinate back to something I let slip previously, which was your assessment, your comparison of how Tucker Carlson stuck in your craw, but Ben Shapiro you were at peace with. While I will admit that Tucker Carlson's public thinking is not as rigorous and necessarily consistent or polished as Ben Shapiro's, I am much more at peace with Tucker Carlson, who I think would love to see America look like the entire country of America, look like California in the 1960s, whereas Ben Shapiro would happily send the descendants of all of those people from the glorious days of California in the 1960s, the Beach Boy days, to be ground into dust for Israel fighting in Middle Eastern wars. And so even if Tucker Carlson is less polished and less consistent, and I can't quite identify exactly what he's doing, I still have much, infinitely more affinity for him than I do for somebody like Ben Shapiro, who would not think twice about sending my kids into a meat grinding war in Iran for Israel's benefit. To put it more pithily, I appreciate more that Tucker Carlson seems to broadly have my interests at heart, even if Ben Shapiro has a more principled approach to how he operates.
Yeah, if I had to be ruled by Tucker Carlson or Ben Shapiro, I would pick Tucker Carlson. I guess it stems from the incorrect framework I'm applying of the intellectual framework, because I think Ben Shapiro is a better intellectual than Tucker Carlson. Shapiro has a coherent worldview. You can follow his chain of thinking from A to B to C. Tucker Carlson is the opposite. He's unpredictable. He's chaotic. And so the dichotomy of chaos and order, Shapiro is order, Tucker is chaos. And that's what disorients me about Tucker Carlson.
I'm an Azorius player. Nobody wants order more than I do, but I don't look for that order to come directly from my pundits, the pundits that I support or oppose. And I think that the world that Tucker Carlson is trying to create is one with a lot more order and a lot less chaos than, at least for the United States, at least for America, for Western Europe, maybe not so much for Israel, than the world that Ben Shapiro is trying to put in place. And that'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.